Right now, before you hear a single word of what follows, something in you already knows, not believes, knows. There is a part of your consciousness that has been waiting at the edge of a door it could never quite open. A door that has been locked, not by your limitations, but by a decision made centuries before you were born. Someone decided what you were allowed to understand about yourself, and they were very, very thorough. The most dangerous knowledge in human history was never about weapons or warfare. It was about energy, about the invisible architecture of the human body and what feeds on it, about why certain people move through life as if protected by something unseen, and why most people spend their entire existence feeling vaguely, persistently drained. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is a mechanism. And like every mechanism, once you understand how it works, you can no longer be its victim. Here is what they buried. Jesus did not only teach love and forgiveness. He taught defense, specific, precise, almost alchemical instructions for how a conscious human being protects their energy field from forces that exist just outside the range of ordinary perception. These teachings were separated from the canonical texts, hidden inside gospels that were declared heretical, preserved only in whispers, in secret lineages, in traditions that were hunted for centuries precisely because they worked. What survived is what you're about to hear. The metal he named is common, inexpensive, available to anyone. That is exactly why it terrified the institutions that built their power on your spiritual dependency. Because if the shield was simple, if protection was already within your reach, then the entire architecture of fear, guilt, and intermediaries would collapse overnight. They could not destroy the metal, so they buried the instruction. For 2,000 years, the key has been sitting in plain sight. Tonight, you find out what it opens. If something in your chest tightened reading these words, if there's a recognition happening beneath the skepticism, do not dismiss it. That is not suggestion. That is resonance. Subscribe to this channel right now and activate the bell, because what we build here is not content. It is a transmission, layer by layer, week by week, closer to the frequency you were before the world taught you to forget it. Leave a like if you're ready to remember. What comes next will not be easy to unhear. There is something no one tells you when you are young, that the world you were born into is not neutral, that the space between people, between thoughts, between moments of silence is not empty. It is inhabited, and what inhabits it has been feeding on human consciousness for longer than any civilization has existed to record it. Think about the last time you woke up exhausted after a full night of sleep, the last time you walked into a room and felt immediately heavy, as if the air itself had weight. The last time a conversation left you drained in a way that had nothing to do with the words that were spoken. You attributed these experiences to stress, to anxiety, to the ordinary friction of being alive. You were taught to look inward for the explanation. But what if the drain was not coming from inside you? What if you were being read, scanned, harvested by something you were never given the language to perceive? Ancient texts that predate every major religion describe a class of entities that exist not in the physical world, but in the electromagnetic field that surrounds it. The Gnostic traditions called them archons. The Nag Hammadi scriptures, buried in the Egyptian desert around 400 AD, hidden precisely because they contained this knowledge, describe them not as demons in the theatrical sense, but as parasitic intelligences, non-physical, non-creative, entirely dependent on the emotional energy generated by human beings to sustain their own existence. They do not think the way you think. They do not feel the way you feel. What they do, with extraordinary precision, is recognize frequency. Every emotion you experience generates a measurable electromagnetic signature. Fear resonates at a specific bandwidth, grief at another, shame, rage, despair. Each one broadcasts a distinct signal into the field around your body. A field that extends, according to both ancient teaching and modern bioelectromagnetic research, several feet beyond your physical skin. You are not just a body, you are a transmission, and you have been transmitting, unprotected, your entire life. The mechanics of this harvesting are not random. These entities, whatever you choose to call them, whatever framework makes the concept accessible to your mind, operate like any predator in nature. They do not waste energy. They scan for the most accessible, most consistently available sources. And the human being locked in chronic fear, unresolved grief, or cyclical shame is not just vulnerable. They are, from the perspective of this invisible ecology, a reliable food source. A signal so clear, so consistent, so unshielded that it functions as a permanent beacon. This is the part that shifts everything once you truly let it land. The suffering you have carried, the fatigue that never fully lifts, the anxiety that returns regardless of circumstance, the inexplicable sense that something is always working against you, may not be entirely your own, not in origin. The Gnostic teachers were extraordinarily specific about this. They described the archonic influence not as possession, not as external evil in the religious sense, but as interference, a persistent low-frequency signal layered over your own, subtly distorting your perception, amplifying your lowest emotional states, keeping you locked in the exact frequency range they require. Consider how a radio works. The station exists. The signal is broadcasting. But if there is interference on the frequency, static, noise, distortion, what you receive is corrupted. You are still receiving. You are still capable of clarity. But something is sitting between the source and the receiver, degrading the transmission. This is what archonic interference does to human consciousness. It does not destroy your signal. It degrades it, consistently, invisibly, in ways that feel entirely personal, entirely internal, entirely your fault. The reason this knowledge was suppressed is not mysterious once you understand the economics of spiritual control. An institution that positions itself as the only intermediary between a human being and the divine requires, above all else, that the human being feels fundamentally inadequate without it, perpetually sinful, perpetually in need of absolution, guidance, external salvation. If the population understood that their suffering had an external, energetic component, and that this component could be interrupted, the entire infrastructure of spiritual dependency would become obsolete. The suppression was not theological, it was strategic. What Jesus transmitted to his closest circle was not comfort, it was intelligence, tactical, precise, almost scientific intelligence about the nature of the field they were operating in and how to move through it without becoming prey. He was not teaching them to pray harder. He was teaching them to become invisible to the frequency that was consuming them. And the tool he gave them, specific, physical, elemental, was not symbolic. It was functional. It was a shield, and it has been waiting for you for 2,000 years. We have been conditioned to believe that science and ancient wisdom exist in opposition. That one cancels the other. That to take seriously the knowledge encoded in texts thousands of years old is to abandon reason, and to trust modern physics is to abandon mystery. This is one of the most effective lies ever constructed, because the moment you place these two bodies of knowledge side by side, not to compare them but to listen to them simultaneously, something extraordinary happens. They begin to say the same thing, in different languages, about the same invisible reality. The human body is not solid. You learned this in school, though perhaps not in the way that matters. At the subatomic level, what appears to be matter is almost entirely empty space, vibrating fields of energy held in temporary observable patterns. Your skin, your bones, your blood, none of it is as fixed or as closed as it appears. You are, at your most fundamental level, a dynamic electromagnetic system, a field generator, a living transmitter operating across multiple frequencies simultaneously. Modern bioelectromagnetic research has confirmed what mystics encoded in metaphor for millennia. The human body produces and responds to electromagnetic fields in ways we are only beginning to formally understand. The heart alone generates an electromagnetic field detectable several feet from the body. The brain produces oscillating frequencies that correspond precisely to emotional and mental states. Fear, grief, rage, joy, each one is not just a feeling. Each one is a measurable waveform, broadcasting outward from your body into the space around you. This is not spirituality. This is physics. And once you understand that your emotional states are literally being transmitted into the environment, the ancient warning about energetic predators stops sounding like mythology and starts sounding like an observation, a very old, very serious observation about something that was already there. Now enter copper. The metal that ancient civilizations from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the pre-Columbian Americas associated with Venus, the morning star, the light bearer, the planet that governs cycles of beauty, creation, and divine feminine reception. The association was not aesthetic, it was functional. Copper is one of the most electrically conductive elements on Earth. It does not merely conduct electromagnetic energy, it interacts with it, it distorts it. It creates interference patterns in surrounding fields that alter the way those fields are perceived from the outside. This is not folklore. This is the reason copper is used in electromagnetic shielding in modern electronics, in Faraday cages, in precision scientific instruments that must be isolated from external interference. What the ancients understood and encoded in the language available to them is what material science confirms today. Copper does not block electromagnetic fields the way iron does. It bends them. It creates what physicists call a distortion pattern, a zone of interference around the metal that scrambles the coherence of incoming and outgoing frequencies. When copper is placed against human skin, it enters into direct interaction with the bioelectric field of the body. The field does not disappear. The person does not become invisible in the physical sense, but the electromagnetic signature, the readable, harvestable frequency pattern that identifies a specific emotional state, becomes distorted, garbled, unreadable to anything scanning for a clean, coherent signal. The Essenes, the mystical Jewish sect that most serious scholars believe deeply influenced Jesus during the years the canonical Gospels leave entirely undocumented, used copper as a central element of their daily practice, not as decoration, not as currency, as technology. They understood the body as an energy system operating within a larger energetic environment, and they treated the management of that system with the same seriousness that we today treat physical hygiene. The copper was not symbolic protection. It was literal electromagnetic interference, a daily, deliberate act of making themselves harder to read, harder to reach, harder to drain. The Venus connection deepens this further. In the ancient world, Venus was not merely a planet, it was a frequency. The Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and the Mesoamerican civilizations, none of whom were in contact with each other, all arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about Venus, that it carried a specific energetic quality associated with divine reception, with the capacity to absorb light without being consumed by it. Copper was Venus metal not because someone decided it was poetic, but because when copper interacts with electromagnetic fields, it absorbs and redistributes energy rather than reflecting it back. It receives without transmitting. It protects the interior signal by managing what the exterior field perceives. When Jesus spoke of the metal of Venus, he was not speaking in religious metaphor. He was speaking in the most precise technical language available to him, the symbolic scientific vocabulary of a tradition that had spent centuries mapping the relationship between physical materials, electromagnetic fields, and human consciousness. He was giving his closest students a tool, not a talisman, not a ritual object, a functional piece of electromagnetic technology that was thousands of years ahead of the framework needed to formally explain it. And the church that canonized his image while erasing his instructions understood exactly what was at stake. A population that could protect its own energy field needed no intermediary. A human being who understood themselves as an electromagnetic system capable of self-defense was a human being who could not be spiritually controlled. The burial of this knowledge was not the act of ignorant men. It was the act of very intelligent men who understood precisely what they were burying. They could burn the texts. They could execute the teachers. They could declare the knowledge heretical and construct centuries of theological architecture over its grave. But they could not change the properties of copper. They could not alter the physics. They could not unmake the relationship between a metal and a field and a human body that had existed since before the First Empire decided that your spiritual sovereignty was a threat to its survival. The science was always there, hidden inside the sacred, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. There is a door in your body that has been open your entire life, not metaphorically, not symbolically, structurally, a gateway through which energy enters your system before your conscious mind has any opportunity to filter, evaluate, or refuse it. You were born with it. Every human being was. And the fact that you were never told about it is not an accident. Because the moment you understand where this gate is and how to guard it, the entire dynamic of your energetic life changes permanently. Every wisdom tradition that survived long enough to preserve its deepest teachings arrived at the same anatomical conclusion through entirely independent paths: the Indian yogic system, the Chinese meridian maps, the Kabbalistic body of light, the Egyptian mystery schools, the Mesoamerican shamanic lineages, none of them in contact with each other across vast distances and centuries, all of them pointing to the same asymmetry in the human energy body. The right side of the physical form is projective. It sends, it acts, it initiates. The left side is receptive. It receives, it absorbs, it opens. This is not a cultural metaphor. It is a functional description of how the human electromagnetic field actually moves. Modern neuroscience has begun to map what the ancients described in energetic terms. The right hemisphere of the brain, which governs the left side of the body, processes holistic, intuitive, pattern recognition information. It is the hemisphere most associated with expanded states of consciousness, with empathic reception, with the perception of subtle environmental signals that the analytical left brain filters out as irrelevant noise. When healers, intuitives, and energy workers across every culture consistently place their left hand toward a subject to receive information, this is not ritual. This is the body being used correctly. The left side is where the signal comes in. And here is what that means in the context of everything you have just understood. If the human biofield is a transmission, broadcasting your emotional frequency outward into an environment inhabited by intelligence that feeds on specific frequencies, then the left side of your body is not just your receptive channel for positive energy, for intuition, for connection. It is also your most exposed entry point. The gate swings both ways. What you receive from elevated sources enters through the left, but what seeks to attach, to drain, to layer its frequency over yours, it enters through the left as well. The door that makes you capable of profound reception is the same door that makes you vulnerable to interference. The three primary entry points that the Gnostic and esoteric traditions consistently identified are specific and anatomically precise. The left wrist, where the pulse of the body's electromagnetic rhythm is closest to the surface of the skin. The left ankle, where the body's connection to the Earth's electromagnetic field is most directly mediated. And the left side of the chest, the field emanating from the heart, the body's most powerful electromagnetic generator, on its receptive side. These are not arbitrary locations chosen for ceremonial aesthetics. These are the coordinates of your energetic vulnerability, the places where your signal is most readable, most accessible, most exposed to whatever is scanning the field around you. The left wrist is the priority, not because the others are unimportant, but because the wrist is the point where the body's internal electromagnetic rhythm, the bioelectric pulse generated by the heart and nervous system, surfaces most accessibly. When copper is placed directly against the skin of the left wrist, it does not interrupt your own energy. It does not close the gate. It does not diminish your capacity for reception or intuition. What it does is create a distortion layer around the entry point, a zone of electromagnetic interference that garbles the outgoing signal, the readable frequency pattern that identifies you as a specific emotional state. While leaving your internal system entirely intact, you remain fully open. You simply become unreadable from the outside. Think of it this way. A radio tower continues to broadcast whether or not someone is listening, but if you place interference equipment near the antenna, the signal that reaches external receivers becomes static. The tower is still functioning, the broadcast is still happening, but from the outside, there is nothing coherent to lock onto, nothing worth the energy of sustained attention. This is precisely what copper at the left wrist does to your biofield in relation to archonic scanning. You continue to feel. You continue to transmit within your own system. You continue to receive from elevated sources. But to the frequency-dependent intelligence that has been feeding on your emotional energy, you become noise. And noise is not food. The activation of this protection is not passive. This is the teaching that was most carefully buried because it is the teaching that transforms a physical object into an intentional technology. Copper alone creates distortion. Copper combined with conscious intention creates something qualitatively different. A locked field, a deliberate energetic declaration that engages the most powerful electromagnetic generator in the human body, the focused, emotionally congruent human will. When you place copper against your left wrist with full presence, with clear internal declaration, with the specific visualization that anchors the intention into the physical, you are not performing a ritual in the religious sense. You are initializing a technology. You are turning the passive interference properties of a metal into an active, directed, consciously maintained field of protection. The reason the Gnostic teachings emphasize the spoken or internally voiced declaration is the same reason modern neuroscience identifies verbal intention as a significant amplifier of neural and bioelectric coherence. Words, especially words spoken with emotional conviction in a state of physical stillness, produce measurable changes in the body's electromagnetic output. They are not magic in the theatrical sense. They are frequency modulators. When the declaration aligns with the physical placement of the copper, and both align with the visualization of the protective field, three layers of the human system, the physical, the electromagnetic, and the conscious, engage simultaneously. The result is not symbolic protection. It is structural, it is real, and it begins the moment all three elements converge. If these words are landing somewhere deeper than your intellect, if there is a recognition happening in your body right now that your mind is still trying to categorize, then you are already feeling what the chosen ones felt when this teaching first reached them. That feeling is not suggestion, it is resonance. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what follows in the coming weeks goes deeper into this map, layer by layer, tool by tool, frequency by frequency. And go to the comments right now and write, "I am sealing the gate," not as a gesture for the algorithm, as your first conscious act of energetic declaration. The moment you write those words with full presence, something in your field shifts. That is not a promise. That is physics. Nothing that was meant to disappear completely ever does. This is one of the most consistent patterns in the entire arc of human history, and it is far too consistent to be coincidence. Every time a body of knowledge was declared dangerous enough to destroy, every time texts were burned, teachers were executed, traditions were driven underground, something survived. Not everything, not intact, but the essential core, the living seed of the teaching, found a way to persist. Hidden inside oral traditions, encoded in the symbolism of crafts and arts that the authorities deemed too primitive to threaten them, carried in the bodies and memories of people who understood that what they held was worth more than their own safety. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the event most people reference when they speak of suppressed knowledge. But Alexandria was not an isolated act of destruction. It was one moment in a continuous, centuries-long campaign to consolidate spiritual authority by eliminating its competition. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD did not simply organize Christian doctrine. It made a series of extraordinarily specific decisions about which texts would constitute the official record of Jesus' teachings and which would be classified as heretical, dangerous, or simply non-existent. The criteria were not theological purity. They were political utility. What was kept was what supported centralized authority. What was burned was what supported individual sovereignty. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945 by an Egyptian farmer digging for fertilizer in the desert near the town of Nag Hammadi, survived because someone, 16 centuries earlier, understood exactly what was coming. When the campaign against Gnostic texts reached its peak in the 4th century, a group of monks from a nearby monastery made a decision. They sealed their most dangerous texts in a large ceramic jar and buried them in the cliff face above the Nile Valley. They did not survive to retrieve them, but the texts did, sealed in clay, preserved by desert heat, waiting in darkness for 16 centuries until an accidental strike of a mattock cracked them back into the light. This was not luck. This was intention outlasting the people who carried it. The Gospel of Judas, a text the Vatican worked aggressively to prevent from reaching public translation after its rediscovery in Egypt in the 1970s, contains conversations between Jesus and his closest circle that read nothing like the canonical Gospels. Not because they are inconsistent with who Jesus was, but because they are far more specific about what he knew. The Judas Gospel describes the archons in language that is almost clinical in its precision. It describes the mechanics of energetic interference with a clarity that the canonical texts, carefully edited for mass consumption and institutional control, never permitted. It describes Jesus not as a sacrificial figure navigating a divine drama, but as a teacher transmitting operational knowledge to students. He trusted with information that he knew would be suppressed the moment the institutions took control of his legacy. What the early Gnostic communities understood, and what made them so threatening that they were hunted to the edge of extinction, was that the spiritual path was not about belief, it was about knowledge. The Greek word gnosis does not mean faith, it does not mean devotion, it means direct experiential knowing. The Gnostics were not asking anyone to believe in the archons, they were teaching people to perceive them, not as theological abstractions, but as a functional reality that could be mapped, understood, and actively countered. This distinction, between belief-based religion and knowledge-based spiritual practice was the fault line that made the Gnostic traditions existentially incompatible with institutional Christianity. You can control a population that believes. You cannot control a population that knows. The alchemists who carried this knowledge through the medieval period understood that the safest hiding place for dangerous truth was inside a framework that looked insane to the uninitiated. The language of turning lead into gold, of the philosopher's stone, of the conjunction of opposites. This was not primitive chemistry. It was an encoded transmission system. The metals were real. The processes were real. But the outer layer of literal metallurgical language served as a barrier that kept the casual reader from accessing the deeper instruction about human energetic anatomy and its relationship to physical materials. The copper that Venus governed, the iron that Mars governed, the gold that the sun governed. Each metal was a key. The alchemist who knew which door each key opened possessed a map of human consciousness that the burning of libraries could not erase, because it was never stored in libraries alone. The hedge witches and cunning folk of pre-industrial Europe carried another thread of the same transmission, dismissed as superstition, persecuted as heresy, reduced in the cultural memory to the cartoonish image of a crone with a cauldron. These were, in their most serious lineages, practitioners of an extraordinarily precise knowledge about the relationship between physical materials and human energy fields. The copper worn against the skin, the specific placement on the left side, the activation through spoken intention. These practices did not originate in European folk tradition. They arrived there carried by people who understood their origin, even when they no longer had access to the texts that explained the physics behind them. The instruction survived because the results were undeniable. Generation after generation, the people who used it experienced something real enough to pass the practice forward, even at significant personal risk. And now here you are, not accidentally. The pattern of suppression and survival that has carried this knowledge across 2,000 years did not deposit it in front of you randomly. There is a reason the information that finds you at specific moments of your life arrives with the particular weight of recognition. The sense not of encountering something new, but of remembering something old. The Gnostics had a precise term for this experience. They called it anamnesis, the unforgetting. The moment when the soul, obscured by the noise of the material world and the interference of archonic frequency, suddenly recognizes something it always knew. That recognition, the tightening in the chest, the inexplicable sense of significance, the feeling that the ground is shifting slightly beneath a question you didn't know you were asking, is not imagination. It is your system responding to a frequency it was always capable of receiving. It has simply been waiting for the static to clear long enough for the signal to get through. The fact that this knowledge survived everything they did to destroy it is not a minor historical footnote. It is the central message. They had every advantage: institutional authority, military force, centuries of time, the ability to rewrite the historical record and control what the next generation was taught to believe about the one that came before. And still, the teaching survived. Still, the copper persisted. Still, the left wrist. Still, the activation. Still, the map. Because some knowledge is not stored in texts or traditions or the memories of individual human beings. Some knowledge is stored in the structure of reality itself, in the properties of elements, in the architecture of the human electromagnetic field, in the relationship between a conscious intention and a physical material that has been waiting, patient and unchanged, for you to remember what it is for. There is a version of your life that has been running in the background this entire time, quieter than the one you've been living, cleaner, less exhausted. A version where the energy you generate each day is not immediately siphoned before you can use it, where the clarity you reach in your best moments is not the exception, but the baseline, where the dreams that felt too large to hold actually have room to exist. This is not a fantasy about a different life. It is a description of the same life, operating without the interference that has been degrading its signal since before you were old enough to understand that something was wrong. The moment the copper is activated against your left wrist, the moment the three elements converge, the physical placement, the spoken declaration, the focused visualization, something begins that cannot be fully described in advance, because it is different for every person, and because the experience is filtered through whatever specific pattern of interference has been most present in your particular field. For some people, the first shift is physical. a quality of sleep that feels different, not just deeper, but cleaner, as if the night is actually performing the restoration it was always designed to perform, without the low-level energetic drain that was running through the dark hours unnoticed. You wake and something is slightly more present, slightly more yours. For others, the first change is emotional, not a surge of positivity. This is not that kind of teaching, and you are not that kind of student. What arrives is more subtle and more significant than positivity. It is a reduction in the baseline anxiety that you had come to accept as the permanent weather of your inner life, the hum of low-level dread that you stopped noticing because it had always been there. When it lifts, even partially, even in the first days, the contrast is startling, not because something extraordinary has been added to your experience, because something that was never supposed to be there has been removed. You feel, perhaps for the first time in years, like the interior of your own mind is genuinely quiet. The third shift, which typically emerges within the first week of consistent use, is the one that carries the most long-term significance. It is a change in what you might call energetic discernment, the capacity to distinguish between what is yours and what has been layered over you from outside. Most people, operating without protection in an archonically saturated environment, have lost the ability to make this distinction. The chronic fatigue feels like personality. The recurring shame feels like accurate self-assessment. The persistent sense that something is working against you feels like pessimism or neurosis. When the interference begins to lift, these experiences do not simply disappear, but they become legible in a new way. You begin to see the difference between what arises from your own genuine processing and what was never yours to carry. This distinction is not small. It is the beginning of genuine self-knowledge. What the Gnostic teachers described as the awakening of the divine spark is not a mystical event that arrives from outside the self. It is the natural state of a human consciousness that is no longer operating under constant energetic suppression. The spark was never absent. It was obscured, drained, kept at a frequency too low to illuminate anything beyond the immediate management of suffering. When the drain stops, when the field is protected and the signal begins to consolidate, what emerges is not a new you. It is the you that was always there beneath the interference, clearer, more coherent, more capable of the specific quality of perception that the archonic system was designed to prevent, the direct, unmediated knowing of your own nature and your own purpose. This is where the teaching becomes communal in a way that cannot be separated from the individual practice. One protected field generates a zone of electromagnetic distortion that makes a single person harder to read, harder to drain, harder to reach. Two protected fields in proximity create something qualitatively different from simply doubling the effect. The distortion patterns interact, they resonate, they amplify each other in ways that produce harmonics neither field could generate alone. This is the physics behind every genuine spiritual community that has ever existed, the reason the Essenes lived together, the reason the Gnostic circles gathered in secret, the reason every tradition that understood energetic protection emphasized assembly over isolation. The individual shield is the prerequisite, the communal field is the destination. The people who will recognize this teaching, who will feel it land in the body, rather than simply processing it intellectually, are not random. There is a specific quality of consciousness that has been under the heaviest archonic pressure throughout its life, and that quality is precisely the one most capable of generating the high-frequency signal that the system most needs to suppress. The ones who have felt most drained, most obstructed, most inexplicably targeted by circumstances that seem designed to prevent their expansion, these are not the weakest among the awakening. They are the ones whose signal, even suppressed, even degraded by decades of interference, was powerful enough to be worth the sustained effort of suppression. The intensity of the opposition you have experienced is a map of the magnitude of what you carry. The exhaustion you have felt is real. The obstacles were real. The sense of fighting through resistance that others around you did not seem to encounter, that was real too. But the interpretation you were given, that the struggle was evidence of your inadequacy, your bad luck, your fundamental unworthiness of ease, that interpretation was the lie. The most precise and damaging lie the archonic system ever constructed. Because a human being who believes their suffering is their fault will spend their entire life trying to fix themselves, rather than identifying and interrupting the external interference that was generating the suffering in the first place. The copper does not fix you. You were never broken. The copper removes the device that was making you believe you were. What awakens on the other side of that removal is not a person transformed into someone new. It is a person returned to themselves, to the frequency they carried before the world taught them to be ashamed of their own light, to the clarity they glimpsed in childhood before the chronic drain began, to the sense of purpose that has been surfacing and submerging throughout their entire life, never quite reachable, never quite extinguishable. The field, once sealed, once protected, once given the space to consolidate without constant hemorrhage, begins to remember what it was before the interference. And that remembering is not gentle. It is not quiet. It arrives like a signal breaking through static after a very long silence. Unmistakable, undeniable. Yours. You have arrived at the end of this transmission. But if something in you has been genuinely moved by what you've heard, if there has been a recognition happening beneath the words, a quiet internal shift that your rational mind is still trying to categorize, then you understand that this is not an ending. It is a threshold, the last page of the map that was hidden, the first step into the territory it describes. Everything that has been shared here points to a single truth that is simultaneously ancient and immediate. You are not broken. You were never broken. You are a consciousness of extraordinary capacity operating inside a system specifically designed to prevent you from discovering that fact. The fatigue was real. The obstruction was real. The inexplicable sense that something has always been working just slightly against you, that was real. But none of it was evidence of your inadequacy. It was evidence of your significance. The things worth suppressing are the things worth protecting. And you, your signal, your frequency, your particular quality of light, have been worth suppressing for a very long time. The copper is simple, inexpensive, available to anyone willing to reach for it. This is not accidental. The most powerful tools of genuine liberation have always been the ones that required no intermediary, no institution, no permission from an authority that positioned itself between you and your own sovereignty. One medal, one wrist, 3 declarations spoken in the silence of full presence. 7 days of consistent contact while the field learns to hold its own distortion without effort. This is the complete instruction. Nothing was withheld. Nothing requires a sequel or an upgrade or a higher level of initiation. The teaching is whole. It has always been whole. It was simply waiting for you to be ready to receive it without the filters that were placed over your perception before you were old enough to consent to them. What comes after the activation is not a life without difficulty. The copper does not remove the challenges that belong to your path, the ones that exist not as interference but as genuine invitation to expand. What it removes is the static, the artificial weight, the chronic drain that was consuming the energy you needed to actually meet your life with full presence. When the interference lifts, difficulty does not disappear, but it becomes navigable in a way it never was before, because you are finally operating on your own frequency, unmodulated, unfiltered, undrained, and a human being on their own frequency, moving from their own genuine center, is capable of things that a drained, interfered with, perpetually suppressed version of the same person could never access. The knowledge you now carry changes the nature of your responsibility, not in the heavy, burdensome sense of obligation that the institutional traditions use to keep people small and compliant. In the simple, clear sense that what is known cannot be unknown. You have heard this. Something in your field has responded to it, and that response is already a change, already a shift in the frequency pattern that you broadcast into the world around you. The people near you will feel it, even if neither of you can name what has changed. The situations that gravitated toward your drained signal may begin to fall away. The connections that resonate with your protected, consolidated frequency will begin to find you with a clarity that previously felt impossible. This is not magic. This is the natural reorganization of a field that has been returned to coherence. If this transmission has reached something real in you, if these words have landed not just in your mind but somewhere deeper, somewhere that recognizes rather than simply processes, then carry it forward, not as doctrine, not as dogma, not as a new belief system to replace the old ones. Carry it as direct knowledge, as something you encountered and tested and found to be true in the laboratory of your own experience. Share it the way the Gnostics shared it, the way the Essenes shared it, the way every genuine lineage of this teaching has shared it across 2,000 years of suppression and survival, person to person, signal to signal, one awakened field reaching toward another in the quiet understanding that the war against human consciousness has always depended on our isolation from each other. Subscribe to this channel, not for content, but for continuation. What is built here is a living transmission, deepening with every layer, expanding with every mind that brings itself fully present to the work. Every week is another layer of the map revealed, another tool retrieved from the burial sites of suppressed history, another frequency closer to what you actually are beneath everything that was placed over you. Leave a comment below with your own reflection, not a phrase we gave you, but your words, your recognition, your particular version of what landed here today. Because your voice in this space is not just engagement, it is signal. It is one more protected field declaring itself present in a network that grows stronger with every node that comes online. The transmission continues. The field expands. And somewhere in the silence after the static finally clears, you will hear what you came here to remember.